Welcome, my name is GJ, and today I'd like to talk to you about calendars, because with the first human settlement on the horizon, one question has not yet been answered. What calendar will we use on Mars? Now, the theme of this conference is The Time Has Come from Mars, and I'm going to show you how the Lukashian Calendar can bring time to Mars. We will start, however, with planet Earth, because that makes it easy to see how it works. After that, we'll move right on to Mars. On Earth, the most widely used calendar is the Gregorian calendar. We are so used to it that most people don't realize how complex the old calendar actually is. We have the seconds that run from 0 to 59, except when there's a leap second, then it's 0 to 60. Leap seconds are sometimes added because the rotation of the Earth is gradually slowing down, so then we have minutes of 61 seconds. The minutes run from 0 to 59 as well, but the hours run from 0 to 23, except when there's a daylight savings time switch. Now those are particularly nasty because they turn back the clock 1 hour from 2 a.m. to 1 a.m. So when it's 1:30 on one of those nights, which 1:30 is it? The first one or the second one? You can't relate a timestamp to a unique point on the timeline anymore, which I think should be a very basic requirement of any calendar. There are 7 days, each with a different name, and every week has a week number. The days of the month run from 1 to 28, 29, 30, or 31, with February having 29 days when the year is divisible by 4. Unless it's also divisible by 100, then it's not a leap year. Unless it's also divisible by 400, like the year 2000, which was a leap year. We have 12 months, each with a different name as well, and the year, which doesn't even start at 1. Because the Gregorian calendar is a continuation of the Julian calendar, it actually starts at 1582. And how about the time zone? Whenever you're working with a date from the past, you have to take into account the way time zones looked back then. And it was only about 75 years ago that they looked totally different. Also, in an increasingly globalized world, the drawbacks of having time zones are starting to outweigh the benefits. Then there's the 12-hour system with AM, PM, and have a look at the clock. What does this point stand for? 7, 19, 35? Imagine waking up with a jet lag in a hotel room after a long flight, like I did 2 days ago. If you don't know whether it's morning or evening, the clock won't actually tell you the time of day. All of this complexity is insane. You don't make this up. And that is exactly the problem. It was never made up. It was never designed. It grew organically over thousands of years. But there's an even bigger issue. See, in the old calendar, every day has the same duration. In reality, though, because the orbit of the Earth is elliptical and because the Earth's axis is tilted, certain days can be as much as 50 seconds longer than others. The old calendar simply takes the average duration and applies this to every day so that they all have the same length. This sounds like a good idea, but it has a nasty side effect. To see this, let's imagine that we're in a part of the year where an old calendar day is 30 seconds longer than a real solar day. A day on the old calendar now ends 30 seconds later than it should. The next old calendar day is not only 30 seconds too long, but also starts 30 seconds too late because of the previous day. Now the difference is added up to 60 seconds. Eventually things will even out again, but at certain points the difference between old calendar days and real solar days can be as much as 16 minutes here on Earth. Our biological clock follows real days, not old calendar days, and being 16 minutes out of sync with your biological clock definitely does not improve your health. In reality, days and years simply do not have a constant duration, not here on Earth and not on Mars. And because the rotation of a planet around its own axis is independent of its orbit around the Sun, there's no whole number of days per year either. Having days and years with a constant duration and having years with a whole number of days might seem easy, but it leads to hacks and workarounds like leap seconds and leap years, not to mention a mismatch with our biological clock. Several proposals for Mars calendars have similar structures, complexities, and problems. It was time for a new design. Now, when you redesign a calendar, you have to ask yourself, what is a calendar anyway? Now the obvious answer is that it's a way to measure time, but actually the official unit of time is the second. So to measure time, you don't need a calendar, you need a stopwatch. A much better way to define a calendar is that it's actually a model of the movements of a planet around the sun in such a way that it's useful to people on that planet. So how do you know it's useful to people on Earth? Well, you ask them. This is Kral, and he's a caveman. He doesn't know modern society. And he doesn't know the old calendar either because it didn't exist in his day, so we have an unbiased view. And when the Lukashian calendar was designed, we asked him what he thought it should look like. We asked him what he could see. And he told us that he could see days because of day and night, and he could see years because of the seasons. And he was aware of the gradual passing of time during the day. Kral also asked us if we could please embrace the fact that days and years don't all have the same length, because he's used to his biological clock. Now, all of these things are real. They follow from nature. Everything else, such as hours, minutes, week numbers, time zones, does not follow from nature. It was made up by society over time. Kral doesn't need any of it, and neither do we. Now, this is one of the most beautiful quotes I know. Perfection is achieved, not when there's nothing more to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. And the Lukashian calendar was designed with this in mind. So let's clear our minds of everything that we're used to. Let's start with a completely clean slate and let's see what the Lukashian calendar looks like. The Lukashian calendar has years that correspond exactly to actual solar years. They run from midwinter to midwinter when the North Pole points exactly away from the sun. That means that they don't all have exactly the same length. Some years can be a few hundred seconds longer than others. The days correspond exactly to actual solar days. They too don't all have exactly the same length as we've seen before. And this means that a year does not have a whole number of days. Instead, a day belongs to the year in which it starts, even if it finishes in the next year. Some years will then naturally have an extra day like this one. And that means that we don't need those complex rules for leap years anymore. So by designing the calendar around variable durations of days and years, we no longer have to shoehorn reality into a calendar that doesn't fit. Leap seconds and leap years and leap year rules are unnecessary, and the calendar perfectly matches our biological clock. A week is a period of 10 days. The first 7 are working days and the last 3 are weekend. Each day simply has a number, such as 1, 2, 3, here on Earth all the way up to 365 and sometimes 366. We don't need months, and the days don't need names like Monday or Tuesday. To know which day of the week it is, we just look at the last digit. Is it an 8, 9 or a 0? Then it's weekend. The last few days of the year can then be a holiday period where we celebrate New Year or any other festivity, after which the days of the next year will start. Speaking of start, when does the Lukashian calendar actually start? Or, in other words, what is the current year? Well, years go from midwinter to midwinter. That follows from nature. And days correspond exactly to actual solar days. That follows from nature too. But when to start counting? That doesn't follow from nature. That is the only thing that is for us to choose. Now on Earth, the current Lukashian year is 5,925. That means that on Earth, the Lukashian calendar started 5,925 years ago. This number was chosen for 3 reasons. Number 1, the last 2 digits of the year are the same as on the old calendar, for most of the time, since midwinter isn't too far from the old calendar's new year. Number 2, all of human history for which we have a date fits in the calendar, so we don't need before 0 dates. Events that happened before the Lukashian calendar started don't have an exact date anyway. For example, dinosaurs lived 100 million years ago, but this doesn't have an exact date, so they don't have to be in the calendar. Now, just looking at those 2 reasons, we could have chosen 5,025 or 6,025. So why exactly 5,925? Well, that's because of the 3rd reason. Here we see a picture of the orbit of the Earth around the Sun. And here we have midwinter, when the North Pole points away from the Sun. Now, this is a natural moment for one year to end and the next year to start. But what would be a natural moment for one day to end and the next day to start? Now, first of all, the Lukashian calendar doesn't have time zones. It is the same time everywhere on the planet. So the moment when one day ends and the next day starts will be the same for everyone. So when should that be? Well, that would be when it's nighttime for the vast majority of the world's population. And that is when the entire region, from Western Europe to East Asia and from West Africa to Australia, is facing away from the sun. Now, it will be early morning for East Asia and late evening for Western Europe, but it will be nighttime for everyone here. This would be a perfect time for one day to end and the next day to start. For the other half of planet Earth, a concept called shadow time is currently in the works to make it easy for that half as well. But weren't we talking about when to start counting the years? What does this have to do with that? Well, I'll show you. Here are some arbitrary midwinters from the past that we could have chosen as the start of the calendar. Now, what would the calendar look like if we would have chosen midwinter B to start the calendar? Well, then this would have been the first year, this would have been the second year, etc. And these would be the days of the first year, the days of the second year, etc. And these would be the points in time when one day ends and the next day starts. Now, what would this look like if we would have chosen midwinter A instead? Well, then this would be the first year, this would be the second year, etc. And these would be the days of the first year, the days of the second year, etc. And these would be the points in time when one day ends and the next day starts. Now, if you compare these, then the years are the same because they go from midwinter to midwinter, but the days, they look totally different. How can that be? Well, that is because the start of the calendar defines both when one year will end and the next year will start, as well as when one day will end and the next day will start. The first year and the first day start when the calendar starts, and as we've seen, the point at which the calendar starts is the only thing that is for us to choose. After that, astronomy takes over and a day will be a solar day and a year will be a solar year. So if we have a natural point for a year to start and a natural point for a day to start, we must choose the start of the calendar in such a way that it coincides with both. And at the very point of the midwinter, 5,925 years ago, the region that we saw in the previous picture happened to be facing exactly away from the sun. So by choosing that particular midwinter as the start of the Lukashian calendar here on Earth, the last two digits of the year are mostly the same, all of human history fits, and the majority of the people will start their day in bed. So we have our days, we have our years. What about time of day? What do we use for timekeeping? Well, because each day has a slightly different duration, we cannot use hours and minutes because they have a fixed duration. Besides, we don't want this horribly complex system anyway. We want something much, much simpler. Now, if you think about what time of day actually is, then it's really quite simple indeed. The time of day is simply the proportion of the day that has passed. It's inherently a proportion. And this proportion is then expressed using beeps. Now, a beep is simply a number that runs from 0 to 9,999. Each day is then divided into 10,000 little pieces. Here on Earth, one beep is then about 8.5 seconds, which is just about what we need to have a useful unit to tell the time of day. Now, for those interested, the word beep comes from basis point, a term used in finance to express much smaller proportions than percents. Basis point then became BP, which then became beep. But it's really just 1 in 10,000, just like a percent, which is 1 in 100. Of course, if each day has a slightly different duration, then beeps of different days have a slightly different duration as well, but the difference is very small. In fact, the shortest beep of the year is only 5,000ths of a second shorter than the longest. The technical implementation provides a much higher precision than beeps, enabling you to uniquely identify individual milliseconds on the timeline, as we will see later. But first, let's have a look at how long beeps are, just to get an idea. 10,000 beeps is a day, 1,000 beeps is about 2.5 hours, 100 beeps is about 15 minutes, 10 beeps is about 1.5 minutes, and 1 beep is about 8.5 seconds. Now, beeps give you a much better idea of how much of your time you spend on things. For example, if you spend 3.5 hours gardening, what proportion of your day is that? You could calculate it, but it's not immediately obvious. Whereas if you spend 1,500 beeps gardening, that's 15% of your day. So beeps give you much better insight into what proportion of your time you spend. A typical schedule would look like this. You get up at 3,500, you have lunch at 5,400, and you go to bed at 9,800. Of course, these times differ between regions since there are no time zones in the Lukashian calendar. So, bringing it all together, the Lukashian calendar has days, years, and beeps to tell the time of day. That's it. No more complexity. No more hours, minutes, weekdays, week numbers, months, daylight savings time, leap seconds, leap days, time zones, AM, PM. If Kral doesn't need it, neither do we. Alright, well, this is the convention of the Mars Society, so how about Mars? We've seen how it works on Earth. How does it work on Mars? Well, the key thing is that the Lukashian calendar is inherently designed around days and years with a variable duration and a variable number of days per year. For Earth, each individual day is calculated using the equation of time, and the duration of each individual year is calculated using the solstice algorithm of Jan Meus and the tidal deceleration constant. But the mechanism makes no assumption whatsoever about how long a day or a year should be, or how many days a year should have. And that means that you can simply plug in different durations and you have a calendar for a different planet. So for Mars, let's see what this looks like. This is the Lukashian calendar for Earth, where each year is about 31.6 million seconds long, each day is about 86.4 thousand seconds long, and we have 365 or 366 days per year. And this is the Lukashian calendar for Mars, where each year is about 59.3 million seconds long. Each day, or sol, is about 88.8 thousand seconds long, and we have 668 or 669 days, or sols, per year. And as you can see, the mechanism works exactly the same. These are the weeks in an Earth year, as we've seen before, and these are the weeks in a Mars year. The only differences are that Mars days, or sols, are slightly longer and that the final week lasts 8 or 9 days instead of 5 or 6. When it comes to time of day, a beep is 1/10,000th of a day. On Earth this is about 8.6 seconds and on Mars about 8.9 seconds. Is this not a problem when we want to compare durations between planets? Well, no, because the purpose of a calendar is to tell the time of day and to make it easy to create daily, weekly, and yearly schedules on a certain planet. If you want to compare durations, then you should simply use seconds because that's the official unit of time. We don't want to use beeps for that. Now, the best thing about the Lukashian calendar is that it's not just an idea. It has a fully functional implementation with a state-of-the-art programming interface, which is completely free to use and fully open source. Unlike the old calendar, it provides a continuous timeline without holes and overlaps, where each timestamp corresponds to a unique point on the timeline. I wrote a little program to demonstrate a few features. It uses the Earth durations of days and years, but there were some challenges with recording a live demo, so This morning I ran the demo program on my laptop and put the output in the slides. So what you're about to see, just pretend that it's the real live output of the demo program, and if you don't believe me, just come see me afterwards and I'll give you a live demo. Yes, so let's start with the current date and time, or at least current as it was this morning. It is day 293 of the year 5925, and the time is 7604 beeps. Now the length of this day is 86 point something million milliseconds. One day later it will be day 294, and the length of that day will be slightly different from the length of today, just so you know. Now let's do a little experiment. Let's define A to be today at 7000 beeps. And let's define B to be tomorrow at 1000 beeps. Now, if there are 10,000 beeps in a day, how many beeps would there be between 7,000 today and 1,000 tomorrow? Exactly, 4,000 beeps. And the amount of milliseconds in between A and B is 34 point something million milliseconds. Let's remember that. And now let's do the whole thing again one day later. So now we define C to be tomorrow at 7,000 beeps, and we define D to be the day after tomorrow at 1,000 beeps. Now, the amount of beeps in between is still going to be 4,000, obviously, but the amount of milliseconds in between C and D is now slightly different. And this makes perfect sense, because if 2 days have a slightly different duration, then the amount of milliseconds between these times is going to be slightly different on different days. And this is a perfect example of how the Lukashian calendar was designed around variable durations of days and years. If you want to know exactly how long any particular day is, the calendar will tell you. But if you don't want to think about such differences, the calendar will abstract those differences away from you and just give you an intuitive answer in terms of beeps. And looking at those beeps, there's 4,000 of them. 3,000 come from this day and 1,000 come from that day. And as we've seen, if 2 days have a slightly different duration and a beep is 1/10,000th of a day, then the beeps of those days have a slightly different duration. Again, if you want to know exactly how long a beep is on any given day, the calendar will tell you. But if you don't want to think about such details, the calendar will abstract them away from you and just give you an intuitive answer. Now let's have a look at how accurate the calendar actually is. Let's go back to the current date and time, or at least current as it was this morning, and then we have this as our timestamp. Now the proportion of the day that has passed at that timestamp is this. And here we can see that the amount of beeps is really just the truncated version of the proportion of the day that has passed. It's just the 4 most significant digits. And the amount of milliseconds since the start of the calendar, all those 5,925 years ago, is this, 186 point something trillion milliseconds. Now, 1 millisecond later, our timestamp looks like this, and at first sight, it looks the same. But if we zoom in, we can see that after about 7 decimals, the proportion of the day that has passed is slightly different. And of course, the amount of milliseconds since the start of the calendar is 1 higher than the previous one. So despite the fact that in the Lukashian calendar days and years have a variable duration, and despite the fact that beeps of different days have a different duration as well, the calendar is still very much able to uniquely identify individual milliseconds on the timeline. Now, this demo only uses a fraction of the available date and time operations. So if you want to see some more, or if you want to see the source code, then just come see me afterwards. From the very start, the Lukashian calendar was designed for plugging in different sets of durations in order to create instances for different planets. The mechanism simply needs to know the durations of the days and the years, as well as when to start the calendar, because as we've seen, the start of the calendar determines when days and years will end and a new one will start. It knows these things for Earth and could just as easily do this for Mars. Now, it's easy to find approximate durations of a Martian day or year, but exact calculations for each individual day and year, like the ones we have on Earth, are harder to determine. This is still an ongoing development. When it comes to the start of the calendar, well, for Earth, we chose it in such a way that all of human history fits. For Mars, that would require the start to be at least about 70 years ago, when we did the first flybys. Also, we want the start of a new day to be during nighttime. This will depend on the exact location of the landing zone and the first settlement, because that has to face away from the sun when a new day starts. So, to sum it up, the Lukashian calendar has a universal mechanism that provides an astronomically accurate calendar on any planet, moon, or space station that will ever inhabit. A fully functional technical implementation that takes care of every detail involving calendar mechanics. Now, this technical implementation also provides features for central maintenance and governance of the actual durations of days and years, so that, if desired, organizations like the Mars Society or NASA or NIST can maintain an official version of those numbers. And finally, a logical and simple design that lets inhabitants of space settlements live in perfect harmony with their biological clock. Then, analog missions around the world could use the Lukashian calendar to practice and evaluate it, and they could use the Earth version in doing so. After all, analog missions do take place on Earth. The Lukashian calendar is the only calendar that allows this. The experience for analog astronauts will be nearly identical to that of actual Mars settlers, when it comes to the calendar, of course. So if you or anyone you know can help, please get in touch and we can get that analog project started. You can send an email, contact me on LinkedIn, or just pull my sleeve anytime this week. Old calendar week. So, by going back to the drawing board and embracing variable durations of days and years, the Lukashian calendar is simple, logical, and accurate. When we go to Mars, we get to create a whole new world from scratch. We have a green field. Let's get it right. If you want to know more, check lukashian.org, where you can find all the info, the technical implementation, a converter between the old calendar and the Lukashian calendar here on Earth, and a Lukashian clock to put in your office. I'm just saying. In the meantime, this talk lasted around 200 beeps, which is 2% of your Lukashian day here on Earth. Hopefully well spent. Thank you.